Rearming the Red Army, flush with oil money, Russia moves to shore up its military. Well, modernizing its might, or is Moscow marching towards a new arms race? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, Russia has test-fired a ballistic missile, prompting fears of a new military power struggle between Moscow and the West. President Dmitry Medvedev has been spooking the United States in particular by striking arms deals with socialist South American leaders. Well, this latest test signals to the rest of the world that Moscow is committed to flexing its military muscle. Russia's newest missile, the Sineva, was launched from an underwater position in the Arctic on the weekend. It then flew 11,500 kilometers to hit an area near the equator in the Pacific Ocean. Well, Russia began expanding its armed forces under Vladimir Putin to a degree that hadn't been seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. In May, Moscow's Red Square held its first military parade in 17 years. Continuing in Putin's footsteps, President Dmitry Medvedev is making no secret of his wish to show Russia's army is back and ready to go.
We will continue to commission new types of weapons, but we will also continue testing the ones we have now. Their effectiveness has been proved by time. Our shield is fine. As we found out, war can break out unexpectedly and take absolutely real forms, and local, smouldering conflicts, sometimes called frozen conflicts, can turn into real war conflagrations. Russia's armed forces, in the operation to force Georgia to peace, fulfilled their task with distinction.
Well, let's take a closer look at the Russian military expenses in the recent years. Dating back to 2002, Russia spent around $5 billion. Well, 2 years down the line, in 2004, the number almost tripled to $14 billion. And in 2006, that was substantially increased to almost $25 billion. And this year, Russia allocated $40 billion. Well, last month, the 2009 budget that calls for a 25% hike in defense spending received preliminary approval. Now the figure we're looking at is $50 billion. Well, within a span of only 7 years, Russian military expenditure has increased tenfold. And this trend is not expected to change in the years to follow. Well, Russia's geographical position may also explain the increasing injections of cash into the military, strained relations between Moscow and neighboring countries, and tensions with Washington have renewed a focus on Russia's security and its military capability. Well, in the short war with Georgia last summer, Russia felt its military weakness was exposed. Although they were able to crush the Georgian army, Russia suffered serious losses. Well, then there's the continuing fears over U.S. plans to base a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. It's a move which Russia views as a threat to its security. Well, Moscow also has concerns over plans for Georgia and the Ukraine to join NATO. A Russian army official warned his country would take military action and other steps if the plan goes ahead. Well, we're joined now by our guests in Moscow, Alexander Pikayev. He co-directs the Carnegie Moscow Center's non-proliferation program and an advisor to the Defense Committee at the State Duma. In Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute. And in London, Matthew Clements. He's a Eurasia analyst at Jane's Defense Country Risk Department. Thanks so much for being with us. If I could start with Mr. Pikayev, is this the start of a new arms race?
Oh, absolutely not. I would say that Russia is returning back to normalcy. The situation when the country which possesses army 1 million men spent just $5 billion annually, this money is not enough for that army, and it's simply dangerous because when you have hungry soldiers, it might undermine your domestic security.
Nevertheless, sorry to interrupt you, but nevertheless, it does represent, for this year alone, a 25% increase in military spending. Why such a big increase?
Oh, yeah. it's still 10 times less than military budget of the United States. And according to international financial organizations, the economy is not considered as militarized if a country spends up to 5% of its GDP for the military. Russia spends less than 4% for its military, even after the substantial increase which is expected next year. So we are talking about very small money. Russian military budget is on a par of military budget of such countries like Britain, France, but geographical location of Russia is very different. We are not surrounded by friends. We have Islamic fundamentalists in the south, we have rising China in the east, and yes, we have NATO, which is coming closer to both Russian capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, so that unfortunately Russia has to spend more for its military and needs to modernize its military, which is absolutely essential.
All right, you put things in a nice context
1990s.
for us, Alexander. Let's go over to Richard in Washington and say, if it does represent such a small percentage of what other countries, particularly the United States, spends on military budgets, is it likely to signal or to encourage other countries in the West to increase their military spending?
I don't believe so. I think that so far, at least in the United States, there's been a recognition that the budget increases are modest in the sense that Russia's starting from such a low base. In terms of U.S. military planning, the revival of Russian military power seen in the last few years really hasn't affected the programs that are planned for the U.S. Defense Department. Western Europe, it might be a bit different. They're perhaps a little closer. I understand that Norway, for example, it's been having some effect in their planning, perhaps in Eastern Europe as well. But from the U.S. point of view, really people in short term are thinking about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and long term they're still thinking more about China than Russia.
All right, let's take that question to Western Europe and over to Matthew in London. Will this increased spending represent any kind of change in the balance of power?
Well, not really. I think one of the points that we need to draw out here is that due to inflationary pressures in Russia, the actual increase in defence spending as a net may have increased greatly, but as in actual real terms, it really hasn't increased much at all. And as a percentage of GDP, Russian defence spending actually reached a peak in 2003, 5 years ago. So we're not really seeing the increase in defence spending having such a great effect. It's still not enough to modernise the armed forces. It's enough to maintain a strategic deterrent, but it's not able to modernise and reform in the way that Russia would really need to if it was to challenge other states such as the US.
All right, let's go back to Moscow. Alexander, is the military modernization program sustainable at this sort of exponential rate if it's dependent on things like high oil prices?
Well, actually, I may compare this $50 billion military budget as exactly amount which Russia invested into Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, American mortgage agencies which are have been nationalized recently. Russia possesses significant hard currency reserves, around $550 billion, plus to that Ministry of Finances controls two funds at an amount around $200 billion, so that Russia has very big reserves. It's the third largest in the world after China and Japan, and if something happens with oil prices, if they continue going down, well, the budgetary deficit would be financed from those funds. It could be financed for several years, so that the modernization program would continue. There is no alternative for that. Russia lost 10 years after the end of the Cold War. There was no money for rearmament. The existing weaponry in Russian army was produced primarily in Soviet times, and of course the Russians need to produce modern weaponry, and for that money would be found. There is a quite rigorous modernization program until 2020, and the expectations here are that despite difficulties Russia has, it would be able to fulfill its goals.
Richard in Washington, would it be fair to say there's been a shift in Russian thinking, and this is perhaps one sign of it, a move towards a different military doctrine?
Well, I don't know if it's a different military doctrine. It's certainly a different declaratory policy. But that has been evident for several years now. I would trace it back to even 2006, really, when the Russians first started focusing in on this question of the missile defense system the United States wanted to deploy in the Czech Republic and Poland. And since then, there's been a series of statements affirming Russia's military strength, saying that they'll be able to overcome any defenses that the United States or other countries are able to develop in terms of missile capability. But I would trace it last few years. The doctrine, it's still under revision, but I haven't seen that major change so far. I mean, I still think the Russians aimed to have a full scope military capacity, being able to deal with nuclear and conventional and sub-conventional forces, military conflicts. But there's been no prioritization, so I would hesitate to say there's been a major change in the last few months. It's more in the last few years I would look at.
Right. Matthew, in London once again, do you think that perhaps Russian prioritizing of military spending might face limitations of internal challenges, the economy, demographic challenges? How far can Russia go in prioritizing its military spending?
Well, I think in the long term, we're looking at the very long term now, because of the reliance on hydrocarbon resources and the lack of investment in other areas of the economy. I think we are going to see some more economic pressures growing, and this is going to be exacerbated by the demographic crisis. But I think in the short term, it's certainly going to maintain, it's certainly going to focus on these issues and the military spending as a way of extending its strategic reach and extending its ability to both react to crises within the former Soviet Union, which it considers its sphere of influence, and also to extend this military power to other parts of the world, which is what we've seen with the naval exercises in Venezuela and various other aspects. But I think only in the longer term, we're really going to see the kind of economic pressures that Russia may face start to take a toll on its defence spending.
All right, interesting you brought up the issue there of global reach. It is now time for a short break. When we come back, we will discuss whether the growing military spending can beef up Russian clout on the world stage. Stay with us here on Inside Story.